the service started, this guy started doing this skipping dance and tambourines came out. And I'm thinking, man, these guys are all basket cases. I came in here to get away from people who are on drugs. Never mind, these guys are all off it. I looked at him and thought, man, that's my psychiatrist. He's treating me. He's my doctor. I'm never going to get better.
Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Gilbo with Inspired. Inspired is all about meeting people from different walks of life who tell their story, their adventure. They talk about their highs, their lows. We're trying to dig deep, be authentic and real, and hopefully stir people's faith amidst the constant bombardment of dreary, desperate, sad, depressing news that we get constantly drip-fed through the media. So I'm really excited this week to have with us Barry Woodward. Welcome, Barry.
Great to be on with you, Simon.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this because, I was with Barry just a few weeks ago at J. John's Evangelist Conference, and he's got a fantastic ministry. He's got a story of being sort of scooped out of the gutter, having been a heroin addict for, was it 15 years, was it?
Yeah, 15 years, yeah.
Yeah, and now doing just fantastic ministry in prisons and in communities, and we'll get to all that, Barry, but I'd love to go right back to your childhood. Paint us a picture. I'm guessing it wasn't that easy.
There were some easy bits and there were some tough bits. I think for me, I was brought up in a regular Northern English working class family. My dad was from a mining community in Doncaster, which is in Yorkshire. Mm-hmm. And then he got drafted into the army and he met my mother in Salford, which is kind of part of Greater Manchester in England. And when he left the army, they got married and they settled in Salford. So it was a typical working class family, mm-hmm. Certainly upbringing, going to school. I hated school. I really struggled at school. I left school at the age of 16 with no qualifications. And it was kind of in my school years when we as young kids, like we did, and people still do now, we were drinking, going to youth clubs, just doing what young people did in our local community. But that was kind of the norm for me. I often say this, I don't really blame anything of my family, the reason why I turned out why I did. It was just my own journey, my own choices that I made. But yeah, it was it was a good upbringing. But yeah, there were some tough times, but generally it was okay.
And zero sort of God context, no religion at all?
Religion in our house was sport.
Yeah.
So I was one of three lads, and obviously sport is a big thing. So that was the thing that we never talked about faith. We never talked about God. For me, from 11 years onwards, music became something I found something to believe in, because there was a massive music scene, like the punk scene that was popular all over the world, certainly in America and then the UK. But that I was like a child when all that was going, like 11, 12 years old. So I kind of found something in that. But I often say, even then, when I wasn't brought up in a religious family, we never talked about God, we never talked about faith. It was a swear word in our house. It was just, but every now and again I would think, there must be a God. And that was it. Okay. That was it. But I never thought about it much. I might have gone to mass on a Christmas Eve or something like that, and after having a few drinks and made a bit of noise and caused a bit of trouble. But there was no God in our family whatsoever, to be honest. Other than me having a little thing every now and again, I think there is a God.
Right. So 16, you leave school. Were you thinking of doing an apprenticeship? What was the plan?
Yeah, again, working class families, we never talked about careers. It was more to do with you left school and you got a job. That was it. And it got a job that paid a wage. So my eldest brother, Shane, he left and got a job as an electrician with a local council, or trained as a local electrician when he left. And then he became a bin man because there was more money in it. Mm-hmm. And he worked all his life basically as a bin man, and he earned more money doing that. My middle brother, Kevin's a painter and decorator. And for me, because I was kind of interested in engines and things like that, and I kind of got a job initially as an apprentice bike mechanic. And I didn't stick at it long. It was a few months. And then I got another job as a car valeter. So it was just about having a job, really, that brought a bit of a wage at the end of the month.
And so can you remember the moment, if you like, when the slippery slope started kicking in?
Yeah, I can. I'd left school. I had my little apprenticeship job. And I met three people, Craig, Huey and Psycho, who were using recreational drugs. They were smoking cannabis, taking LSD, which was really popular back then. taking amphetamines, and that seemed kind of an exciting kind of life for me. We were young, we were teenagers, older teenagers, 17, I was about 16, 17. They were a bit older than me. They were like 19, 20. I think you might have been 21. But they'd been smoking, you know, been using drugs for quite a while. But for me, it was like, oh, this is... And I enjoyed the experiences. Initially, I enjoyed the experiences of that. And it was just like a weekend thing. Then in the week we started to take it. And the big turning point for me was, Simon, was when we were in, one of the girls who we used to hang around with, we was in her bedroom on a Friday night. We were getting ready to go to Manchester. We went to town clubbing every weekend. And we were smoking cannabis. The room's full of smoke. We listened to Bob Marley and the Wailers. The windows are vibrating, the bass line. And one of the lads, Huey, the eldest of us, he came in and he says, guys, I've got some heroin. We call it brown. I've got some brown. Who wants some?
Right.
We'd met this guy who was a bit older than us, an hippie guy, a few weeks before, and he'd been to this with this Billy guy who we'd met, and he got him some heroin and he brought it to us, and I was the last one out of that room to have it. And when I think of a moment in my life, that was the worst choice that I've ever made. And I often say this when I'm speaking to young people in schools, that the choices that we make can make us or break us. And for me, saying yes to heroin that night was the big decision that became the massive downfall. I mean, the recreational drugs, I'm not justifying that, but saying yes to heroin, that was when things started to change big time.
Yeah. Well, I've got a 13, 15, 17-year-old, and I know lots of mates who listen to this with their kids on the way to school or whatever. And I'm hoping that you can paint quite a graphic picture, if you like, of how unglamorous it became, because that's just helpful for us to hear, isn't it? Anyway, so go through the sort of slipperiness and how did it progress?
Well, the drugs that we were taking at that time before the heroin, they call them uppers. In other words, they give you energy, they make you feel awake. Right. Well, heroin is the opposite. It makes you feel relaxed, it makes you feel drowsy. Call them downers, so it's uppers and downers. I'd never experienced that before. And none of us ended up going to Manchester that night. We just stayed in Jackie Marshall's bedroom. We call it, well, it's called even today, gouching out. And you just kind of like, your head keeps nodding down because opium makes you feel so relaxed that you know. So we didn't go to Manchester. We just kept running the toilet and being sick, because that's what happens when you first take opium, an opioid drug, heroin. And then the next day we met up in the local pub and we were like, what was all that about last night? We didn't even go to town. What a waste of money. We're not having that again. And then a few days later, we had it again. And then we had it again. And you stop being sick then, because it's getting into your system. And before you knew it, we're taking it every day. But we changed, Simon. Originally, we were a close group of lads, and there were some girls within the group. There was Craig Ewing Cycle, but there was a bigger group than that. I just mentioned the three. There was 9 of us in that bedroom that night. And we changed. We started to rob from each other and, you know, stealing from our families. But still, if you'd have said to us then, are you addicted? I'd have said, no way, I'm in control. You see, sometimes that thing that you think you're in control of has actually got control over you. But I was good at living in denial. We all was. If you said to any of my mates, are you guys addicted? They've all said the same. But the drug had got us, and we changed, and that was it. That was we were in it now. We were taking it every day. I'd left my job by now. We were trying to make ends meet, surviving by getting money from different places, because there was no methadone prescriptions available then, or they were, but you had to go into a mental health hospital and go on you had to have a massive reason to get on one. So that was it, really. Once we'd been taking heroin for a while, that's when our lives all changed. And, you know, it all started trying to be a bit, trying it, you know, curious about how this drug makes you feel. Then the next minute, we're having to commit crime to pay for the drug that we were addicted to, which was heroin.
What typical crime stuff was it?
Yeah, I think for me, once I'd got into heroin, we used to go into this pub in Manchester. It's still there today. It's what's called the Gay Village. It's been known as that for the last 30 years. Well, we used to go to a pub there before all that emerged to what it is now called the Union, and it was a real dump. And you could buy drugs in there, and there was all kinds of people would go in there. You could buy knocked off gear in there. It's a kind of place where all the villains really used to go. And I liked it in there, and I started to go in on my own. And I met this woman who was into selling cannabis, and I was watching how she was making money, how she went and bought it, and how she broke it up and sold it, and then I started to do that. So that was one of the first things that I started to do. I became a drug dealer, starting with cannabis, and then at weekends I'd sell other drugs, amphetamines and LSD, and then eventually I started to sell heroin. And, I often say this when I'm speaking to young people or anybody listening, I never tell my story to glorify my past.
No.
That's the bottom line. I mean, the real reason and the only reason I tell my story is so that people can know how bad things can get, but also that someone can change and they can stay changed.
Yeah.
But I was locked into this world now. Like this criminal world I'd moved away from home. I was living in Moss Side, or Hume, as part of Moss Side, a really rough area. I'm so sure some of the people who are from England may have heard of it, even abroad. It's a well-known area. And I was living in the thick of it, basically. And that's when I was kind of lost big time.
And did you recognize yourself as lost, or did you kid yourself you were enjoying it?
I was enjoying it for a while. There was lots of highs because I had money. I had a car. I had a flat furniture in it. I had nice clothes. I had gold, things that I thought were important, like council estate things that people think are important. But then there'd be times when there was no heroin around. So there'd be, they call them droughts, and you couldn't get anything. So you'd be withdrawing and you felt ill, and then you'd end up in the police cells. And then you can't have your heroin when you're in the police cell. So there were some highs initially. And it was quite glamorous to have money and to have all the drugs that I had and to have the money that, the possessions that I'd bought, whether they were stolen or not. But then when you end up in prison, like I did, my first time in prison, I was under 21. And because I was an addict, they put me on the hospital wing. There was no treatment in those days. Nowadays, there is a lot of jails have you can go and you can get methadone in prisons. Now, in those days, they didn't give you anything. So they put me on the hospital wing. So imagine being a drug dealer, having all the drugs that you need, more than you need, selling them. So my addiction, my kind of like tolerance was massive. I was absolutely hammering drugs. The next minute, I'm on the hospital wing in Strange Ways prison, a notorious prison back then. And that's all they could do with me. They wouldn't give you anything if you were an addict. You just had to go through what they call cold turkey or do your rattle,
Yeah.
But that was it.
How many years in total did you spend in prison? How many stints?
I've probably been in 4 times. I did like a few months, then 6 months, 12 months. And I've done like bits, I've probably done a couple of years. I often say this when I'm speaking to prisoners, I've never done what we call in jail Big Bird, which is, like a life sentence. But I've been in a few times, I've been in long enough to know and experience what it's like to be away from home, to be cut off from your community of people. And actually for me to be taken, well, I still got drugs in prison, but not to the extent I was getting drugs when I was outside. So when all them restrictions kick in, you're in jail, So I'd experienced that.
So what was your all-time lowest moment to sort of put us off as listeners from ever going down that road?
Yeah, I came out from one prison sentence and I was just so happy to get out. All I thought about when I was in prison was getting off my head, getting stoned. And I said to Lisa, who was my girlfriend, who I'd been living with, I'd lived with her for years by now, a few years, maybe 4 years by now. I was with her in 10 years in total. I said, come on, I want to go and celebrate. I want to get off my head. And we went to the doctors. We got our usual drugs, Valium and DFs, and we bought loads of amphetamines. And that kind of celebration lasted 9 months. And I can say this hand on heart, as a Christian, knowing that God hears everything that we say, I stayed awake for 9 months, speeding, taking amphetamines, and I thought I was invincible when it come to taking drugs. I was into the extreme, and the longer you stay awake on amphetamines, the more spaced out you get. And then, after 9 months, I started to hear voices, and they were horrendous. So when I flushed the chain, when I have to go into the toilet, I'd hear voices shouting out of the water, shouting all these horrible things, like evil, like calling me names. The people that I knew lived on the flats that I lived on, I thought they were at the windows shouting across at me. And I'm like, Lisa, can you hear them shouting across from over there? She's like, Barry, it's all in your head. Don't you tell me it's all in my head.
Yeah.
When that happened, that was the lowest. That was the toughest time of my life. I stopped taking the amphetamine, Simon, but the voices didn't go away. So I had to learn to live with these voices. Eventually, I was taken to Cheadle Royal Psychiatric Hospital. It's called the Priory now. So the Cheadle's like a posh part of Manchester on the outskirts, maybe 8 miles away from the city centre. And it was there when I thought, man, this is the worst place. But all this started Friday night, ready to go out to Manchester, got our best clothes on, got money in our pockets. And then Huey comes in, guys, do you want some of this? So when I look back, if I'd have thought about that choice, if I'd have counted the cost of that choice, how different could have my life worked out?
Yeah.
So here I am now in a mental health hospital. The doctors can't do anything to help me. They put me on a stelazine, an antipsychotic drug, didn't touch anything. So I'm living with these voices. It was torment. It was horrific. And I would never have thought, I thought I was invincible, staying awake. I thought I was, you couldn't. But then when them voices came in, it just zapped all my confidence, a constant knot. When we talk about anxiety, man, my anxiety levels were like through the roof all of the time. Because I was frightened, because for me, them voices then were as real as your voices on this podcast, Simon. They were 100% real.
And as you look back, was that schizophrenia? Was that demonic voices? What was it? I
think it was, the diagnosis was amphetamine psychosis. So there is a diagnosis for what I had. I stayed awake for 9 months. And obviously when you stay awake for 9 months, you're going to do some damage to your mind.
Yeah.
So there is an actual diagnosis for it, and I think it was that. But that said, when I think about the voices that I was hearing, that there was definitely some demonic stuff going on and all of that. So this is the thing. There's a fine line. Is it demonic or is it But in the middle of it all, man, I thought I'd been cursed, Simon. I was convinced I'd been cursed. I thought somebody, because I'd met this guy. He used to live he lived in our block, and he used to come into my flat late at night, and I got friendly with him. A mixed race guy, had green eyes, Neville. And I went to his flat a couple of times. I lived on the corner flat right at the end of, like, maybe on the 9th floor. And he was into kind of, he had like Buddhas, and he was into witchcraft, and he was into that kind of new, spiritual, dark spirituality. Yeah. So for me, that I thought, oh, Neville's cursed me. It turned out he was a policeman. He knocked on my door early hours in the morning with a uniform on. It freaked me right out. He was a copper living in our block. He was an actual copper. It freaked me out. But after I was hearing these voices, I'm thinking Neville's cursed me. But I don't think that's the case. I think my head just popped because of the abuse.
Yeah. Hey folks, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I'm loving the response we're getting from across the world. It's just wonderful to see how encouraging and inspiring it is being and hitting the spot. Listen, if you are being blessed by it, I'd love it. Basically, this happens under the auspices of our ministry, Great Lakes Outreach, which works in the poorest and the hungriest country in the world, which is Burundi. We're having an incredible impact in the toughest of circumstances. We want to carry on supporting those local folks doing a great job. So if you wanted to, greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. You could make a donation there. I'd so appreciate it. Also, it's word of mouth, isn't it? So gossip these podcasts to other people, get them to subscribe, give us a great review. Absolutely wonderful. So grateful to you. So that's greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. If you want to do a monthly, a couple of quid a month, or a one-off donation, we'd be incredibly grateful. All right, now let's get back to the podcast. So 15 years heroin addict, and let's come to the key point. So what happened?
So 15 years an addict, 9 years hearing voices. I'd moved away from the centre of Manchester to the outskirts, and I'd split up with Lisa, who I mentioned before, who I'd been with for 10 years. Mm-hmm. And I'd moved away to get away from the madness, but I was still using drugs.
Yeah.
Since my breakdown, when I had my mental breakdown, that's what it was, I went to the council and I said, look, I've had a mental breakdown. Can you give me an exchange? So they sent me and Lisa to see a flat which is on the outskirts of Manchester, and we moved in another council estate, which is like an overspill estate from central town, Manchester, and we lived there for 3 years. I was still hearing voices, still using drugs, but I couldn't take I couldn't stay awake a long time because of, obviously I'd stay awake for a few nights and that was it, because my head couldn't handle it because of the voices I was hearing. And then me and Lisa split up, and then I ended up getting a flat on my own after I lived in a couple of hostels. I've even spent a year living in James Street Salvation Army Hostel in Salford. So when I think back to that Friday night in Jackie Marshall's bedroom, you know, the glamour of it all and the young bravado, young typical Mancunian going out on a Friday night thinking I was it and all of that. And then here I am, having my mental breakdown. I'm living in a hostel now. I'm not with Lisa. I've not got any money. So all the glamour had gone big time.
Yeah.
I'm living on my benefits, buying drugs with my benefits and buying extra drugs from people who were on prescriptions and stuff. You know, so when we talk about the glamour of it, the glamour was not very long compared to years and years later, how I'm living. But then there was a massive change happened after that.
So what happened?
So I'd moved into this new flat, and I had like Buddhas in my house, and I'd got into meditation, and I think I wasn't looking for God, but I was curious about things. I was still using my methadone, been on that for years. I was on a maintenance prescription. I was still smoking some cannabis and taking, you know, amphetamines and what have you, but not taking loads of it because I couldn't handle it. But then this particular Thursday, after I cashed my benefits, I was on benefits for years and years. I cashed my benefits and I got my money, and I got on this bus and I went into the town centre. And the bus takes off after I get on, and then this guy gets on the bus to stop after me. And he had a borsal dot on his face. A borsal dot is what people do to say they've been in prison. They put it on the cheek. But basically to say they've been in borsal. Now, they still do it now. I still see it when I go into jails now. But back in the day, it was a thing that young people did to say, I've been in borsal, like a sign of, you know, letting people know. He had a really fat neck and short, stumpy fingers. And he sat next to me on the bus. Mm-hmm. And I was in the mood for a conversation, but he was. And I'm like, oh, he says, are you all right, mate? I'm thinking I was all right till you sat down. And he was dead chatty, and he was really genuine. He just lives down the street from where I am now. He's still a good mate. And we got chatting on the bus, and I got off the bus in Rochdale Town Centre, which is where I've just moved to after being on this other estate and living in these hostels. And I kept thinking about this lad. I'm thinking he was all right. He was really genuine. Mm-hmm. And then I'd be getting, and then I think about, it was all right. Who was that guy? Because he was into music. And I'm into music, but he was into like Northern Soul, but he knew some of the clubs that I knew about in Manchester, so there was a connection. And then the following Sunday, I had a Jack Russell called Kim, and I used to take her to the local behind the local hospital to this field. And as I'm walking past the hospital the following Sunday, I bumped into this guy again who I'd met on the bus on the Thursday. And I'm like, you all right, mate? How you doing? Remember me? Of course I remember you. Where have you been? I've been to church. And I'm like, oh no, he's a Bible basher. He says, you can come if you want. We meet in the hospital grounds. And he pointed to where the church meet. And I'm like, mate, I'm okay. I don't want to go to church. He went his way, I went mine. The next day I'm taking my dog for a walk again. I'm looking for the churches and walking past. Couldn't see a church because I was looking for a traditional style steeple, tower, stained glass windows, graveyard. Somebody stood at the door dressed like Darth Vader kind of church. Mm-hmm. But I couldn't see any kind of building like that. I'm thinking, there's no church in there. So the next day, I'm taking my dog for a walk, as I did every day, to get to the same field behind the hospital. And as I'm walking past the hospital again, I'm looking for a church. Can't see a church. Wednesday, since my breakdown 9 years before, wherever I'd lived in Greater Manchester, because that's the only place I've ever lived, I had to register with a psychiatrist now as well as a doctor. I would always register with a doctor and the local drugs team, but now, so I'd registered with my psychiatrist, but my appointment didn't come through. I had to wait 5 weeks. So that on the 5th week of me being in that area, I got my appointment. And on the Wednesday, this was when I went to see my psychiatrist. His name was Dr. Samuel Yangi. He was from Nigeria. I thought nothing of that appointment because in those days I was having appointment with doctors, psychiatrists, mental health. That was my world. Didn't think anything of that afternoon, taking my dog for a walk looking for a church. Couldn't see a church. So Friday morning, there's a knock on my front door. And I'm thinking, is that the police? And then I thought, no, they don't knock. And I walked into the hallway and I had frosted glass in my door. And I was looking for the shape of the policeman or woman through the glass. And years ago in England, the police needed to be a certain height to get in. I think it was 6'2". Nowadays, they're not fussy to let anybody in. And I was looking through the glass and I was looking for the shape. And I'm thinking, that's too small. That can't be a police person, that. And he opened the door and it was this little woman. She's about 5'2". And she's about 18 stone. And she said, "You all right, Cock? I'm your next door, but one neighbour. I've come to introduce myself." I'm like, "Yeah, okay. You've just moved in, haven't you?" "Well, yeah, a few weeks ago." "Your dad drives a red car, doesn't he?" "Yeah, he does." "You've come up from central Manchester, haven't you?" "Yeah, I have." "You've not got much furniture." I've been thinking, how does she know all this lot? And thinking she must be one of those nosy neighbours. And just as we're chatting away, just before she left, I said, "I don't know if you can help me, Doc, but I met this guy when I was taking my dog for a walk on Sunday last week. And he told me they went to church in the hospital grounds, and this week I've been looking for that church and I can't see it. Do you happen to know where it is?" She says, "Oh yeah, love. I go to that church. I'll tell you Sunday if you want."
Brilliant.
I'm like, oh no, I didn't want to go to church. So on Sunday, she knocks on my door. And we walked up Birchall Road into the hospital grounds, and she takes me into a prefab. It's like a community centre that was inside the hospital grounds. And I'm thinking, I thought she was taking me to church. And people just really casual. There was only about 50 chairs out. I remember sitting down, Dot sits next to me. People coming up to me, they're like, "You all right? Nice to see you." I'm like, why is it nice for you to see me? You don't even know me. People are really friendly. Then I was sat there for a few minutes. There was a tap on my shoulder. I looked round. It was the guy that I met on the bus.
Right.
With Walter Dot on his face, the big fat neck and the short stumpy fingers. He says, "You all right, mate? How are you doing? I didn't think you were interested in coming." I'm like, no, I wasn't, but this is Dot. She knocked on my door. "You don't need to tell me about Dot. Well done, Dot, for bringing him." I'm thinking, these two have planned this. They've set me up. And then I heard the words behind me, "Hallelujah, praise the Lord." I didn't know what that meant then. I looked round and it was my Nigerian psychiatrist.
Wow.
So imagine, Simon, going to a place where you don't know anybody. You live there for a few weeks. You meet 3 people throughout a 10-day period. All of them are Christians, and all of them are in a little community centre-shaped building in these hospital grounds. You'd be thinking, they've set me up. How did they plan this to happen? That's what I was like. I'm trying to work it out, but I feel like God set me up.
Yeah, for sure. And so he's on your case. How did he clinch the deal with you?
Well, the service started. This guy started doing this skipping dance and tambourines came out. And I'm thinking, man, these guys are all basket cases. I came in here to get away from people who are on drugs. Never mind, these guys are all off it. I felt really out of place. Sometimes, you go to church and I was like, man, I was used to clubbing. I was used to there was a massive, well-known club in Manchester called the Hacienda, which was part of my childhood. That's where I grew up, and so clubbing but this was alien to me. It was a culture clash. And then I remember looking over my shoulder. My psychiatrist was behind me with the Bible big enough to choke a giraffe underneath his arm. And he's like, "She came on a Honda. She came." I'm like, "Who came on a Honda?" She tied my bow tie. I'm thinking, he's not even got a bow tie on. I looked at him and thought, man, that's my psychiatrist. He's treating me. And even now I remember thinking, that's not Nigerian. It's definitely not English, and he was praying in this language. But it was like, man, this guy, this he's my doctor. I'm never going to get better.
Yes.
And then the guy gets up to speak, and after his spiel, he said, "We believe in a God who can heal. Is there anybody in this room with any issues?" I'm like, is he having a laugh? I've got more issues than Vogue.
Yeah.
If you want to pray for anything, come to the front. I thought, what have I got to lose? And by now, Simon, I prayed loads of crisis prayers. God, give me bail. This is the last time. I know I said that the last time, but so I prayed crisis prayers when I'd been locked up. But I'd never but this guy's telling me that his God can help me. If he prays for me, I thought, what have I got to lose? So I walked to the front. There was only me stood there. I thought, talk about under pressure. I thought, I'll close my eyes because that's what you do in church. And he put his hand on my head. I'm thinking, what's he touching me for? Then he started to pray. And after each prayer, he said this phrase, "In the name of Jesus." And as he prayed each prayer and repeated that phrase, something started to happen. I was shaking as he was praying and repeating that phrase. I had tears streaming down my cheeks as he was praying and repeating that phrase. I had a feeling inside my stomach like this heat as he was praying and repeating that phrase. I'm thinking, wow, get your hand off me head. Wow. And then he said, amen. I'm like, what does that mean? I opened my eyes and he'd sat down and thinking, I could have told me he'd done. And from that moment on, Simon, something changed. You see, all my natural get up and go had got up and gone. Mm-hmm. Drugs were my get up and go. I couldn't function without having drugs in my system, doing normal, mundane, daily things. But on that day, all my natural get up and go that had got up and gone, got up and came back, because God flicked a switch and he became my get up and go. Amen. Something happened. We talk about a Damascus Road experience. Well, this is a modern day Damascus Road experience. Something happened, something changed. Yeah. And I'm still changed today.
Never touched it again.
4 weeks, I was off the drugs after being prayed for. Never taken drugs since. I remember walking home, I was full of enthusiasm. I walked through the front door of my flat and I stood in the hallway, listening. Couldn't hear voices. Voices had gone. 2 miracles there.
Yeah.
Came off the drugs, 4 weeks, and the voices had gone straight away. So when you've heard voices for 9 years and you get prayed for by a guy in a community centre that's based inside a church, inside church grounds, as weird as it was, and then voices go away, you start believing that there's something in this God factor.
Yeah.
What else could it be? Mm. And the good thing about it all is Samuel, who used to be my psychiatrist, who's now a friend, he can verify this. There's a doctor in the picture who can say, yes, I was there. I saw this happen. Mm.
Wonderful. So, I mean, you're obviously a rough diamond, and holiness, sanctification takes a while. What did your journey look like?
Within no time, I had a sense that God was in it. The first thing I started to do, I started to read my Bible, I started to go to church meetings. I got rid of my telly and video players. Some of the listeners might remember those video players. We used to put big VHS or big bricks in. And I got rid of that, so I wasn't watching telly anymore, even though I enjoy Netflix now. But then I got rid of everything and I started to read and I started to pray. And I felt that God had a plan for my life, that my mess could become a message, that he could take my negative experiences and use them in a positive way. And I was listening to a tape cassette, those old-fashioned things that we used to store music on before Spotify. And it was called From Witchcraft to Christ.
Doreen Irvine.
And it was the story of Doreen Irvine. I'd only been a Christian about 6 weeks. I was lay on my bed. Kim, my dog, was laying next to me. And she's telling a story how she was a highly ranked witch and she had these powers and she would walk on fire and all of that. And then she said, but then God called me to be an evangelist. Those words came out of them speakers and socked me right in the face. That's what God wants. That's what God wants me to be. He wants me to be an evangelist. So I went to the phone. I rang the leader of the church, who was my leader that time, and I said, Alan, I know what it is. I know what God wants me to do. God wants me to be an evangelist. But what's an evangelist? Because I didn't have a clue. Well, I thought a priest, a vicar, anything, a bishop, anything, I didn't have a clue. And he said, all right, we'll pray that one through. And then I learned what an evangelist was. And then I went to hear an evangelist speak. He was from India, a guy called Stephen George, and he used to come touring in the UK. He still does now, he's still around. And he was a Bible teacher, but he was an evangelist. And he would talk, he would walk and talk, reading his Bible. And he was walking and talking one night in a local church. And he stopped and he came right over to me. I was sat at the back with my gruff beard and my rough clothes on. And he said, God's called you to be an evangelist. God is going to use you to deliver many others as you yourself has been delivered. And then he walked away and then he spoke another word over this other guy and he came. So that was confirmation. So that's what I am. That's what I became. I'm still an evangelist all these years later.
Wonderful. So you set up Proclaim Trust and you're in a lot of prisons, aren't you? I mean, I look on Facebook, it's almost every week. Come on, tell us sort of some of the beautiful stories that the Lord's used you to.
Yeah, so I needed a framework to function through. So I went off to Bible. I went to work with an organisation for a year doing evangelism on council estates. They had a tent, they put a tent up, and then they'd get music on and they'd have speakers. And I learned, that's where I first started to speak. We do weekend missions with local churches. We do skills weeks. We do skills camps. We did all kinds of things. It was called the Net Team, based in Accrington. And then I went to Bible College, Cliff Bible College, which is a Methodist college, because they trained evangelists then. And that's, I learned obviously learn about communication. That was the start of my journey as a communicator. Certainly learning more about it. Anyway, I'm still learning now. And then in my last year at college, I needed a framework to function through. So I was given a list of different evangelists who were around that time. J. John was one of them, Andy Ikaramides. And I wrote to these guys. Eric Delve was high profile and going then. And I wrote to these guys. I was doing a dissertation on effective communication. And I wrote to these guys and arranged meetings. And I had a meeting with J. John. And that became the start of me becoming one of his associates, which I am now all these years later. And I met with them and I picked their brains about communication. And then, so the framework, I had the trust set up. And initially I started to do stuff, traditional style communication, trying to be a little bit creative, but traditional 3-point sermons and all of that. Started to travel. I've spoken in India, I've spoken in Sri Lanka several times. I've spoken in America, been to Argentina, various parts of the world. But then when my book came out, Once an Addict, in 2007, it felt like a real God thing. And it was and of J. John was part in all of this. He says, you need to focus on your story, because that's because we're a group of J. John's associates. We've all got our own backstory, but he says, you got you with your story, you can use that and use it really well. So my focus has been since 2007 is telling my story in a really creative and effective way, not just saying it the same every time, but creating talks using my story and all of that. So that's what I do now. I speak in 42 UK prisons a year. On top of that, I speak another 100 times community-based events. I speak in rehabs. I speak at local church outreach events. I only speak at outreach events. I won't turn up to a church to speak on a Sunday morning I've got to be really focused on what I'm doing. So I do some equipping. I do some training in the area of telling your story with various groups. But my only thing really is outreach, missional stuff.
Yeah. So 42 prisons a year. Give us your best stories from prison encounters.
So many stories from what have gone on in prisons. When I just think of a very recent one, I was speaking in a prison in London 2 years ago, and a woman came up. She'd made a response. She'd responded to the gospel, because I always make a response, but do it in a way that's quite subtle and neat. And she responded, and she was talking about writing a book. So I gave her some ideas about how to go about writing a book, because it's something I'd experienced. And then only maybe 7 months ago, she tagged me into something on social media, and she stood there with a publisher. Brilliant. And she's now wrote her own book. I mean, when I think only this year alone, I spoke in 5 prisons since January already, and we've seen over 60 people respond to the gospel just in January alone.
Wonderful. Yeah.
So there's an openness. You have to approach prisons work different, because we have to be really sensitive to the culture that we're in. And we need to use our loaves, basically, but we can still go in there and represent Christ well, and that's what I aim to do all of the time. Yeah.
Once an Addict, you sort of got it by the tens of thousands into prisons, didn't you?
Yeah, the book came out in 2007, and we started a project as a charity to give a copy to every prisoner in the UK. So then, right now, there's 92,000 prisoners behind bars in the UK. So we are focused on the UK.
Yeah.
England, Ireland, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales. And we've sent to date 51,000 copies of my book out free of charge. Of course, we've sold another 50,000, but we've given away 50,000 copies of my book. So of course that generates a lot of. We get letters from prisoners who've become Christians, been affected, and all of that. So that's only part of what we do, but not but certainly it's a focus.
And where did Tina come into the picture?
So I'd been single maybe 6-7 years, and I wasn't really looking for a relationship, as I mentioned before. In those days, I was traveling abroad and doing different things. So being single gave me the freedom to go out and do things without having to consider anybody else. To be honest, I could just get on a plane and do overseas stuff. I was still doing stuff in the UK as well. And then I met Tina, and then it was kind of like, then the change came to do with the UK, and it wasn't through Tina, but Tina is from London, and she came from a tough upbringing herself, but her way out was to get educated. And she ended up going to Nottingham University. She wasn't a Christian, and she got invited to hear J. John speak when he was doing his university missions. So she became a Christian through J. John, and then she started working. So she's a trained social worker. She was going through getting a qualification. So she came out of university with a social work qualification. She started doing a bit of social work, and she was a Christian. Then she started doing voluntary work for an organisation called PAYS, a schools work organisation. She was then with them for a while as a leader, and then she came to the north to set up their social action arm because of her experience with social work. They based her in the offices where Proclaim was at that time. So I wasn't really looking for a relationship, but then we went out for something to eat one Christmas because we were both living on our own. And I said, do you fancy going for a meal? Christmas. We went out for a meal and we talked about faith. We talked about our ministries and all of that. And then I saw her again in the office building and I said, do you fancy going out for another meal? Yeah, okay. So I took her for a Chinese and we talked about faith, talked about our ministries. And then I saw her again a couple of months after. Do you fancy going? Yeah, I took her for an Indian at night. I'll never forget, we're having a meal. And she gets up to go to the bathroom and she walks away. I thought, oh, look at the shape. Isn't she got a beautiful? And I'm thinking, I shouldn't be thinking like this. And then she came back and her perfume wafted under my nose. Like, oh, she smells really feminine. I remember going home that night after dropping her off. And I was like, God, forgive me for thinking like this. I shouldn't be thinking like this. And it was like God gave me a clout round the neck and he said, shut up. This is of me. It's of me. And I'm like, but God, I want to be, but this is of me. So that was the start of, so then I asked her out on a proper date and she said, yeah. And then that was when we started courting. And then a year later, just over a year, I think it was, we got married.
Brilliant.
So yeah, so obviously we're still together and she works for CAP, Christians Against Poverty in Bradford. And I spend probably 6 months of my working year away from home because I spend a lot of time in hotels. But it works the relationship we've got. We spend quality time together when we're together, but obviously we've got our own ministries, our own, not careers as such, but certainly our own work that we're doing. That is our focus, you know. Yeah.
So, you know, we've all got slightly different flavors, us evangelists. You know, for me, having lived in a war zone, expected to die, it's all about urgency. It's about, you know, what really matters. Stuff doesn't matter. You don't take it with you. Let's be all in for now. If you were, you know, what's your sort of DNA as you share your message? Do you want to give us a few minutes of Barry Woodward live?
Well, the DNA of most of my message is that what I would finish on with my basic story is that anybody can change and they can stay changed, and God can take our mess and turn it into a message. Because I know the listeners now, Simon, wherever they are, whatever country they're in, they've been through some stuff. All of us go through stuff. Stuff might be different than mine. But you might not have been into drugs. You might not, but you've been through some stuff. It could be anything. That experience that we go through is gold, and it can be used in a positive way. So it's not wasted. It can be taken and used. And this is my thing when I speak to the prisoners, when I'm speaking in rehabs and I'm sitting there with people who are still on drugs, I'll say to them, you know, the experiences that you go through are not wasted. They can be used. It's just that we need to get through those experiences ourselves and then learn how to use them to help others in this day and age, 100%.
And in prophetic Old Testament speak, he can restore the years the locusts have eaten, 100%. Can't he?
Yeah.
And he's done that with you in abundance.
And just to say, Simon, I'm currently working on a message right now called Even in Times of Chaos. That's my title. And one of the points that I'm making in that is even in times of chaos, you're able to rebuild better. And we talk about the ancient ruins, and God wants all our ancient ruins to be, our areas of our lives to be rebuilt. And that very verse there from Joel chapter 2, he'll restore to us the years. It means those lost years. Yeah. And we can rebuild better, and our lives become better than they ever was before. If we give God permission to come in, to get into the driving seat of our lives.
Yeah. So what are your plans? Are you going to just curl up on the sofa and retire soon?
No, I think J. John summed it up at the conference, really, as he finished, when he told the story. about being in heaven and, Jesus standing up and welcoming us. He says, until let's keep going. I've got no plans to retire. I'm certainly not at retirement age by a long shot just yet. But like John was saying at the conference, John, he said, until Jesus welcomes us home, let's just keep going.
Brilliant. In terms of people booking you, getting in touch with you, give us the blurb.
Yeah, I suppose if you're based in the UK, as I've mentioned, we're a UK-based charity. Our focus is the UK, and that's anywhere in the UK. Even though we're based in the north, I still get down south several times a year to London, to Bournemouth, go down to the West Country, get up to Scotland 3 or 4 times a year, Northern Ireland, I'm out in a few weeks. So they can contact us through the website. So it's proclaimtrust.org.uk. There's a bookings page there. But as I mentioned before, if it's an outreach event, then I'm there. But if it's anything else, I probably wouldn't do it. And I'm always a year in advance booked up. So we're now taking bookings for 2024.
Right.
Yeah.
And you also, we haven't talked about your conference that you do each year, because that's superb, isn't it?
Yeah, we run a conference called Fixed. So it's for recovering addicts, and those who work with addicts. And ex-addicts, let me get that one in, because there's a difference. Some people use different language. I'm an ex-addict, where some will use the recovery language, and that's fine. We've got to cater for all that. So our last conference was last September. It was our 10th anniversary, and we saw 650 people come to that. 600 of them booked in one day. So we opened the registration around June time, and in that first day, the conference sells out. So people come from all over the UK. And all being well, pending on funding, we may be taking that on tour. That's the first time I've told that publicly. But we're looking to do a little tour with that to places where the need is. We're just trying to raise funds to do that. But, yeah. Brilliant.
Well, if people wanted to back you, they can do that through proclaimtrust.org.uk, and we'll stick that in the blurb. Barry Woodward, it's been brilliant. Thanks so much for inspiring me, and I trust you inspired lots of other people. God bless you, bro.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for having me. Appreciate that.
Been great. Well, listen, folks, I hope you've been inspired. If you have, trusting you have, can you share this podcast, gossip it with other people? Give us a great review on Spotify or iTunes. Do get in touch with Barry and his ministry to support them. And if you want to get in touch with me, it's simongilbo.com or any of the social media platforms. I want to thank Adam Thomas Deere for the editing and Mike Sandeman for the mixing. And next week, we're back with another superb guest. But in the meantime, you guys have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Toodaloo.